this episode, we're going to do something that feels simple, but is actually one of the most strategic moves you can make as a learner. Review what you have learned in a way that strengthens long-term recall rather than creating short-term familiarity that fades. When people are new to cybersecurity and new to strategic thinking, it is easy to collect concepts like business goals, stakeholders, threat actors, and risk ranking, and then feel overwhelmed because the ideas blur together. The solution is not to cram harder or to keep adding new material. The solution is to review the key insights in a way that organizes them into a mental system you can remember and use under pressure. Durable recall means you can pull an idea out of your mind, explain it clearly, and apply it to a new question without having to relearn it every time. That is exactly what an exam demands, and it is also what real strategic work demands, because leaders must make decisions consistently and justify them quickly. Today, you are going to reinforce the logic that connects business and threat thinking, so your knowledge becomes structured, confident, and stable. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong review begins by revisiting the central theme that ties everything together. Security strategy exists to protect business objectives, not to chase random technical problems. Business objectives are outcomes the organization cares about, like revenue, trust, compliance, and reliable operations, and they are the reference point for every strategic decision. If you forget objectives, you may still remember security terms, but you will struggle to choose the best answer when multiple options seem reasonable. Remember that objectives are not tasks and not slogans. They are measurable or observable outcomes that guide what leaders prioritize. When you review, you want to practice naming objectives in plain language and describing what must be true for those objectives to be achieved. This is an important mental exercise because it converts abstract ideas into clear statements that can be used to evaluate risk. If you can explain why an objective matters and what supports it, you have built the foundation for everything else, including stakeholder mapping, threat profiling, and triage. That foundation is what makes the rest of your recall durable rather than fragile. From objectives, the next durable insight to reinforce is the idea of value drivers, because value drivers are the forces that make objectives meaningful in the real world. Revenue, customer trust, operational reliability, efficiency, and legal standing are common drivers, but the exact mix depends on the organization's context. The key review point is not to memorize a list, but to remember how to detect value drivers by listening for what leadership measures, worries about, and rewards. When leaders talk about time to market, customer churn, service levels, contract obligations, or cost control, they are revealing value drivers. Your strategic job is to connect security choices to these drivers in a calm, defensible way. A review that strengthens recall should include practicing that translation step. Take a security concept and explain what value driver it protects. For example, recovery readiness supports reliability and revenue stability, while access discipline supports trust and compliance. If you can make those connections from memory, your understanding is becoming durable. A third insight worth reinforcing is the importance of critical business processes, because processes are how objectives become real work. Critical processes like order-to-cash, customer support, service delivery, or payroll are chains of activities that produce outcomes the organization needs. The review goal is to remember how to trace a process at a high level by following inputs, steps, and outputs, and then identifying dependencies that can become single points of failure. This is where beginners often experience a breakthrough, because they stop thinking of security as protecting isolated systems and start thinking of security as protecting flows. In review, practice describing why process tracing reveals what matters most. It reveals which assets are truly critical, which dependencies are hidden, and where disruption or misuse would create the most harm. It also reveals where guardrails can be placed to protect the flow without blocking the work. If you can explain process tracing in your own words and connect it to prioritization, you are building recall that will help you answer exam questions that ask what to protect and why. Next, Reinforce the idea of guardrails, because guardrails are the bridge from high-level goals to executable security behavior. A durable review should remind you that guardrails sit between vague slogans and rigid step-by-step procedures. They are practical expectations, definitions, and decision criteria that help teams act consistently, such as what counts as sensitive data, what changes require extra review, or what access levels are acceptable. The key review insight is that guardrails must be clear enough to guide behavior and realistic enough to be followed. Otherwise, they either create confusion or get bypassed. Review also means remembering that guardrails should align to real workflows, because guardrails that fight the way people work create friction and drive shortcuts. You want to be able to explain why guardrails enable speed and safety simultaneously by making the safe path the easy path. If you can recall the goal to risk to principle to rule chain without looking, you have internalized a strategic method that can be reused across many scenarios, which is exactly what durable learning looks like. Now shift to stakeholder thinking, because strategic security is not only about choosing the right ideas, it is about getting decisions made and executed by real people. The core review insight is that stakeholders are not just titles, they are roles in a decision system, including who has authority, who has influence, who is responsible for work, and who is accountable for outcomes. Review should reinforce the distinction between influence and authority, because fast decisions require both the formal approver and the practical implementers. You also want to remember that stakeholders have different incentives, such as speed, cost, usability, compliance, and stability, and that communication must be tailored to those incentives. Another crucial point is that capturing stakeholder expectations early prevents conflict later, because it surfaces assumptions before they become surprises. Durable recall here looks like the ability to describe how you would engage the right people early, clarify what success looks like, and turn expectations into explicit commitments with ownership and timelines. If you can explain this flow smoothly, you are thinking like a strategist rather than a technician. Threat thinking is the next cluster of insights to review, and the durable version of threat thinking is not fear, it is structured prediction. You should reinforce the idea that threat actors differ by motive, capability, and constraints, and those differences shape what they try to do and how they adapt when blocked. Financially motivated actors tend to seek fast payoff, while long-term access seekers may prioritize stealth, and disruption actors may prioritize visibility and impact. Review should also remind you that many attackers rely on common weaknesses and repeatable methods, which is why credible threats are often ordinary rather than exotic. A durable threat insight is the idea of playbooks, where attackers often follow patterns like initial access, privilege expansion, movement toward valuable assets, and achievement of end goals like theft, fraud, or disruption. You do not need to memorize technical sequences to remember the strategic pattern. If you can describe how an attacker's next move is shaped by what they want and what friction they encounter, you have learned how to anticipate rather than react. With threat actors in mind, review the idea of business-first triage, because triage is how you avoid being overwhelmed by endless possibilities. The durable insight here is that you rank threat scenarios by their impact on critical objectives and processes, and by their likelihood drivers in your environment, not by how scary they sound. Review should reinforce that likelihood can be reasoned about through exposure, incentives, and control effectiveness rather than through vague probability guessing. It should also reinforce that time sensitivity and blast radius matter, because fast-moving scenarios and scenarios with large potential spread can outpace response and multiply harm. Another key triage insight is that dependency chains can turn small footholds into major incidents, so you prioritize scenarios that can cascade into critical pathways. When you remember triage as a structured decision process, you are less likely to drift into reactive thinking. Durable recall means you can explain why a scenario is high priority using impact categories and contextual likelihood drivers, and you can defend that explanation calmly. Now reinforce the linkage skill that connects threat thinking back to business objectives, because this is where many exam questions live. Linking credible threats to objectives means starting with what the organization is trying to achieve, identifying what must be true for success, and then identifying plausible threats that could disrupt those conditions. It also means identifying the assets and processes that must be protected because they support the objective directly. The durable version of this insight is that you link at the capability level, not at the hype level, meaning you focus on what the threat enables, such as unauthorized access, data manipulation, or service disruption, and then you connect that capability to business harm. When you review, practice stating linkages in plain language: objective, threat capability, business impact. This makes your reasoning portable because you can apply it to new scenarios without needing to memorize specific case details. If you can do that, your knowledge is becoming flexible, which is the hallmark of deep learning and the kind of learning that holds up under exam pressure. Risk ranking is the final cluster to reinforce, because ranking is the mechanism that converts analysis into funded priorities. The durable insight is that risk is the possibility of harm to objectives, shaped by impact, likelihood drivers, and control effectiveness, and that ranking must be evidence-based to be defensible. Review should remind you that evidence includes process criticality, obligation amplification, historical incidents and near misses, exposure levels, and the strength or weakness of existing guardrails. It should also remind you that honesty about uncertainty improves credibility, because false precision can undermine trust. A durable risk ranking mindset includes a consistent way of describing risks, a consistent way of comparing them, and a consistent way of explaining why the top risks deserve investment. When you can explain how a proposed action reduces the drivers of a risk and protects a business outcome, you are speaking the language of funding. That ability is not only exam relevant, it is the practical core of security leadership. To make recall durable, you also need to review how to translate technical risk into business impact, because translation is how your reasoning reaches executives. The key insight to reinforce is that executives need outcomes and choices, not detailed mechanisms. Translation begins by naming the asset and the value driver, then describing the threat outcome in plain language, then explaining the business impact and the decision options. Review should emphasize that credibility comes from calm specificity, not dramatic warnings. It also helps to remember that business impact can be categorized as financial, operational, legal, reputational, and strategic, and that using these categories gives your message structure. Durable recall means you can take a technical concept like broad permissions or weak recovery readiness and immediately explain what it could do to revenue, trust, or compliance. If you can do this smoothly, you will be able to handle exam questions that ask how to brief leaders or justify investments. Finally, let's reinforce the most important meta skill behind all of these insights, which is building a connected mental model rather than memorizing isolated facts. The business side and the threat side are not separate units. They are two halves of one reasoning system. Objectives and value drivers tell you what matters. Processes show you where it lives. Stakeholders tell you who decides and who executes. Threats tell you what could go wrong. Triage tells you what to address first. Linkage tells you why it matters. Risk ranking tells you how to justify priorities. And translation tells you how to secure support. When you review with this connected model, you strengthen recall because each concept reminds you of the next concept. That is what makes recall durable. You do not have to remember 15 separate ideas because you remember one system and how the parts connect. As you continue preparing, return to this system regularly by explaining it in your own words, because spoken explanation is one of the strongest ways to test and reinforce memory. When the system is clear in your mind, you will not only recognize correct answers on the exam, you will understand why they are correct, and that understanding is what lasts.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.